Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to start off by building the washers that I'm going to need to cap off these pivot pins. I'm going to be cutting these washers out of a short length of 3/8 round bar. These washers don't need to be extremely accurate, so I'm just going to square off the top quickly and then just eyeball a center punch hole. I'm just going to be using the drill press to drill out the center holes. I only need 5 of them, so it's not a very tall stack. To get the bar straight, I'm just going to line up the side of the bar with the side of the drill bit. This is a cheap vise and a pretty inexpensive drill press, so squaring the bar up to the vise really isn't going to do any good. You have to line it up with the drill. When it's straight in both directions, I'll just start drilling. So at this point, it's just a matter of cutting the washers from the bar. The reason I'm making these washers is because I want them to be at least 1/8 of an inch thick so they don't look like standard washers. So now I have a washer that's smooth on one side and rough sawn on the other. To smooth out the other surface, I'm going to need to set it up in the vise somehow, and the way I'm going to do that is just to set it up on a common nail. This is the same size nail that I've been using for all my rivets, and I've been using that same drill for all the holes that I needed to drill out. So when I drilled out the center of these washers, I just made it to fit that nail. And I also use that diameter to size the ends of the pivot pins that I made. So this pin allows me to have the washer sitting above the vise jaws so that I can file a nice domed surface to the top. And by using a screwdriver pressed up against the side, that gives me just enough resistance so that it doesn't spin around as I'm filing it. But it still allows me to move it around ever so slightly to create a fairly round, even surface. Otherwise, I'd have to readjust this in the vise every 5 or 10 seconds, which would be really tedious. At this point, I'm a little further along. I have all 5 washers riveted in place, and I'm setting up my vise jig so that I can hold the lock plate firmly while I'm filing the top surfaces smooth. All I'm doing here is basically just filing away the hammer marks from the rivet head so that it blends in with the washer. So I'm just working very carefully. I'm moving the file around so it follows the contour of the washer until everything blends in and becomes seamless. Here I'm getting ready to trim the back plate to its final size. I'm just using a framing square and resting it up against the bolts and trimming to the inside. I'm not sure why I didn't do this earlier. It certainly would have been a lot easier without the bolts in the way, but it's not the end of the world. I just need to cut some relief cuts so that I can remove the pieces up to the bolts, and then I can carefully use a hacksaw later on to remove the remaining pieces. The next thing that I need to do is figure out the location of the pin that I need to install on the push rod. This is the pin that the key is going to push up against to operate the mechanism. To be able to figure that out, I need to lay out the location of the keyhole. I know that I want the keyhole to line up with the center bolt in the lock, so I'm laying out that center line as a reference point. And then I'm going to mark the location of that center line on the push rod. I'm also going to mark where the bottom edge of the push rod lines up on the plate. The small mark to the left of the center line is the total distance that the push rod moves when it's opening the lock. So now I'm just going to play around with a pair of dividers to sort of figure out, where the location of the keyhole needs to be. So I've set the dividers at, just a basic spacing that would make a fairly good size key bit. And I'm spinning it around. I know that it needs to clear the top line, and I know that it can't drop off the pin when it's moved all the way to the left. So once I get that sort of in a ballpark, then I can mark the location where the center of the key is. The pin is a piece that needs to be added to the push rod, so I'm going to be making it from a short piece of 3/8 square bar, and I'm going to be riveting it to the push rod. And to make sure that there's absolutely no way that it'll ever work loose, I'm also going to be brazing the whole thing in place. Here I'm getting ready to lay out the tenon that I need to make to rivet this piece to the push rod. This bar is wider than I need, so I'm going to have a tenon that's roughly lining up with the center of the push rod. The remainder of this bar is going to wrap around the front. So the first thing that I'm doing here is marking where the edge of the push rod lines up with the bar. Next I'm going to lay out just roughly a very narrow tenon in the center of that space. So I'm going to be removing this outside section. This narrow section is going to be left for the tenon. This section is going to be removed, and this whole block is going to be what's wrapping around the front of the push rod. So that's roughly what I'm after. Now I need to go through my chisels to find one that I can use to clear out this space. This chisel is not going to be used on this piece, but I do need to cut a corresponding hole in the push rod, so I have to make sure that I have a chisel that'll fit. So basically, to simplify things, I've started off with a theoretical design, and I'm using my chisels to determine whether I need to push an element over slightly to make it fit. And now that I know what I'm doing, I'm just going to use a hacksaw to rough out the spaces. And now I'm just going to use the chisel to clean out the space. You can see how this chisel is still a little bit too wide, and it's pushing the tenon over as I'm driving it in. This is the narrowest chisel that I had in that size range, and if I was after a more machined fit, I would have taken the time to grind a 1/16 of an inch off the outside edge, but for this application it's just fine. I just straightened the pin back out and there was no damage done. Now I need to transfer the location of the pin onto the push rod. Now that I have the push rod drilled out, I'm going to use the narrow chisel to shear out all the metal that's in between the drill holes. That'll clear away enough material to allow me to use a needle file to finish sizing up the hole. So here I have the pin cut down and filed to shape, and I'm ready to rivet it to the push rod. I just need to rivet it enough so it doesn't move around in the fire. I'm still going to be brazing the whole thing. Today I'm going to try something a little different with the brazing. Normally I just wrap copper wire around the piece and let it flow into the joint. This time I found some old brazing rods that I had forgotten about when I was cleaning up the other day, and the flux on them is pretty much deteriorated, so I'm going to use that to braze this piece together. I'm not going to tie it to the piece and let it melt in the fire. I'm just going to use it like a filler rod, the same way you would do if you were brazing using an oxyacetylene torch. At this point I have the piece hot enough so that I can apply the flux to the surface. I'm just using regular 20 mule team borax here as the flux. So even though I'm using a commercial brazing rod as the filler rod, I'm not going to rely on there being enough flux left on that rod to coat all the surfaces of this piece. So I'm applying the borax, heating it up, letting it flow all the way through the joints, and then I'm going to apply the filler rod to do the brazing. And as always when you're brazing, you bring the temperature up very slowly and make sure that there's a good even heat right through the entire cross section of the piece, because it's the bar that has to be hot enough to melt the filler rod, not the fire. If the whole cross section of the bar isn't hot enough, you're not going to be able to get the brazing rod to flow through the entire joint. So here's a piece right out of the fire, and you can see how the brazing rod just coated the entire surface. And here's the piece cleaned up a little bit and back in the log. And at this point I'm trying to decide whether I screwed up this piece or not. The top horizontal bar of this push rod was always a little bit thinner than the rest of it, but it was still heavy enough to do the job. But this time when I ground it, I wasn't paying attention, and I took away way too much from the top surface. And not only does it make it look terrible, I think it left it a little weak, so when I go to use it, I think eventually it's going to distort and bend out of shape, which case the lock isn't going to work anymore. So I have to make a decision about whether I can fix this or do I just need to replace the whole thing. So tune in next week to see how it works out. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. If you have questions and you want to contact me directly, you can do so by emailing me at either one of the addresses that I have listed here. It may take me a couple of days, but I will get back to you. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.